They said the horse ran off during the auction, disappeared into the hills, and was never seen again. But what they didn't know was that he wasn't running away. He was waiting at an abandoned stable, waiting for the only person who ever mattered to come back. This is the story of Bramble, the horse who held on to every memory, and the rider who never forgot where home truly was. The sun broke gently across the horizon, filtering its light through a thin veil of morning mist. The prairie awoke beneath its touch, wildflowers lifting their heads, dew shimmering across the tall grasses, and birds stirring in the oak trees that dotted the landscape like ancient sentinels. Among the slow-rising rhythm of the land moved a solitary figure, a chestnut horse with a white blaze down his face and eyes the color of warm earth. His name was Bramble, and he was alone. Bramble hadn't always wandered the fields without reins or purpose. Once he had worn a saddle. Once he had run with a girl on his back who laughed louder than thunder and leaned low into his mane like she trusted him more than the ground beneath her boots. That was a long time ago. Now, Bramble roamed the high meadows and open woodlands of the countryside, following old trails that had long since grown over. His hooves knew the way better than his thoughts did. Something in his heart guided him, a compass of memory perhaps, or the whisper of an unfinished story. That morning, something changed. The wind carried a different scent. Wood smoke, old leather, and something fainter. Familiar. Bramble lifted his head. The wind brushed past his ears, cool and gentle, curling around him like an old friend. He sniffed again. That smell. He turned north. The path narrowed between two crumbling stone walls, long overtaken by moss and wildflower. Bramble stepped carefully, ears swiveling, the rhythm of his gait steady but uncertain. He had not been this way in years. Not since before she left. Her name had been Elsie. The memory came back like a flood, uninvited but not unwelcome. A girl with sun-bleached hair tied in a messy braid, jeans torn at the knees, hands always dusty, a laugh that could make the crows stop calling just to listen. She was his rider, his friend, his entire world. Until the day she never came back. The wind carried him past broken fences, rusted gates, and the faint outlines of trails that once bore hoofprints and wagon wheels. Birds watched him from the trees. A squirrel chattered at him as he passed a crooked cedar. Then he saw it. Just beyond a thicket of brambles and tall reeds stood the shape of something long forgotten. An old stable. Its roof sagged under the weight of years. Vines coiled up its wooden sides like nature had decided to reclaim what man had built. The paddock fence had collapsed on one side, and a wheelbarrow lay half-buried in leaves. But Bramble knew it instantly. His ears lifted. His heart leapt. Home. He stepped carefully. Into the clearing, hooves crunching through layers of dead leaves. A rusted horseshoe hung crookedly above the stable's main door. One of its hinges had snapped, so the door hung open like a wounded wing. Bramble paused at the threshold. Inside, the air was thick with dust and silence. Shafts of light pierced through holes in the roof, illuminating particles that danced like memories too shy to take full shape. He took a step inside. The wooden floor creaked beneath his weight. The scent of old hay, sweat, leather, and wood filled his nose. And something more. Something sacred. Elsie. He walked past the old tack wall. Cobwebs clung to the hooks where saddles once hung. A bridle, still attached to a worn halter, swayed gently in the draft. Then he saw the stall. His stall. Faded letters were still painted on the wooden slat. Bramble. Inside was an old blanket, threadbare but intact, still bearing the faintest trace of her scent. He sniffed it and let out a long, quiet breath. It was like time had folded in on itself. In the corner of the stable sat a small dust-covered trunk. It was slightly ajar. Bramble nudged it open with his nose. The contents spilled slightly. Papers, photos, a notebook. He recognized nothing visually, but the feeling hit him all the same. This was hers. She had left it behind. Perhaps she meant to return. Perhaps she never got the chance. He pulled back and stood over it in silence. A gust of wind swept through the cracks in the wall, stirring the pages of the notebook until one flipped open fully. On it, in familiar scrawl, was a name, Bramble's Journal. Beneath it, a line, "If I ever lose my way, I hope Bramble remembers for both of us." He didn't know what it meant, but he felt the weight of it, like a promise made in the heart of a child who understood more about loyalty than most adults ever would. The day grew warmer. Light shifted across the stall floor. Birds perched in. The beams above, quiet and watchful. Bramble stood in the stable until the sun reached its peak. Then he stepped out. The world looked different. Not brighter, not darker, just fuller. Like he had unearthed a piece of himself he didn't know was missing, and he knew one thing for certain. He couldn't leave yet. That night, the wind howled over the ridges. Bramble stood in the old paddock, staring at the stars. The trees groaned. The grass whispered. Somewhere in the distance, a fox barked into the night, but the stable stood still behind him, unmoved, unyielding, waiting. Inside, the old notebook lay open. The next page read, March 17th. Bramble. Jumped the creek today. I didn't think he could do it, but he proved me wrong again. He always does. I think he's braver than I am. And beside it, taped with care, was a photograph. A girl in a faded red shirt, smiling, one arm wrapped around the neck of a very young Bramble. He stared up at the stars. Something deep within him stirred, not grief, not longing, but a calling. Tomorrow he would explore more, not because he hoped she was there, but because part of her still was. The morning sun filtered through cracks in the stable's roof like golden ribbons laid across the dusty floor. Bramble stood at the edge of the paddock, ears pricked forward, nostrils flaring. He had not slept much. Something about this place, about the pull it held on his memory, refused to let him rest fully. But he didn't want to leave. Not yet. He turned back toward the stable. That photo, the one tucked inside the journal. It stayed with him all night. Not the image. Horses couldn't interpret pictures like humans did. But the way the paper smelled. The way it felt when the wind turned the pages. The feeling in his chest when he stood over it. It felt like coming home after getting lost for a long, long time. He walked back inside. The wooden boards beneath his hooves groaned in recognition. The stable was old, but it wasn't broken. Not completely. The skeleton of what once stood proud remained. Dust still hung in the corners. Old tack hung crooked on their hooks. In the feed room, a broken grain barrel lay tipped on its side, spilling. A few scattered kernels across the floor like forgotten treasure. Bramble nudged at them out of habit, though he wasn't hungry. He moved slowly, carefully, letting the space speak to him. The wind whispered through the open window above the tack wall, stirring a faded blue ribbon pinned there. Its color had dulled, but its presence was undeniable. He remembered that ribbon. Sort of. It had been a good day. A show, perhaps, or a county fair. The memory wasn't sharp, but the feeling was. Elsie had tied that ribbon onto his halter afterward. She'd laughed as it tickled his face and called him her champion, even if they hadn't won first. Bramble nudged the ribbon with his nose. It fluttered, then stilled. The old trunk was still there, still open. Bramble stood over it again. The keyed notebook remained near the top, but deeper inside, He saw something new. A leather pouch, the string frayed and hardened by time. With care, he nosed it open. Inside were dried apple slices, old, brittle, faded to brown and curled like fallen leaves. But Bramble's heart raced because he knew that smell. Elsie used to hide apple slices in her coat pocket. She'd sneak them. To him before rides, after rides, sometimes just because. He took one in his mouth gently. It crumbled instantly, no longer edible, but the taste lingered just enough. For a second he could almost feel her palm again, her laughter, her voice. You always like the soft ones best, don't you? Outside, the world shifted into mid-morning. Sunlight grew warmer, and the birds grew bolder in their chorus. But inside the stable, time ran differently. Bramble turned away from the trunk and walked toward the back hallway. This part of the stable had always been shadowed, even in summer. The narrow corridor led to the grooming area and the feed loft, and then, eventually, the trail gate. He hadn't walked this path in years. He paused beside the tack room. The door was slightly ajar. Inside, dust coated every surface. Bits of hay littered the floor. An old grooming box lay cracked in the corner, but it was the shelf that drew him in. On it, still standing in uneven rows, were bottles of liniment, old hoof oil, and a box labeled Elsie's Stuff in blue marker. The lid was gone. Inside were odds and ends. A hairbrush with blonde strands still tangled in its bristles, a pair of riding gloves, fingers curled, a horseshoe keychain that jingled when he nudged it. He froze. At the bottom of the box lay a halter. His halter. Dark brown leather, stitched with faded teal thread, and a tarnished nameplate, Bramble. He reached toward it with his muzzle and nudged it gently. The scent of her was strongest here. Sweat, dust, hay, and the warmth of her hands. He closed his eyes and stood still. Outside, the clouds began to roll in. A hush fell over the property. Bramble left the tack room and stepped into the back hallway again. The grooming cross-ties hung, limp, their buckles rusted but intact. He remembered standing here, Elsie brushing his coat, singing softly under her breath, humming tunes she never finished. He had never understood the words, but he remembered the music. He stopped beside the grooming wall. On it, carved faintly into the wood, were initials, E. Plus. B. Bramble traced them with his breath. Then a sound made him lift his head sharply. A branch snapped. Outside. Not a bird. Not the wind. Bramble stepped forward, muscles tense. He trotted quickly, down the corridor and out the rear barn door into the overgrown paddock beyond. His ears flicked. He scanned the field. No movement. Then, a flash of color, a blur of motion between the trees. Too tall for a fox, too quiet for a deer. Human, Bramble walked to the fence line. The boards creaked beneath his weight as he peered over the edge into the thicket. Silence. Only the wind. But something in him stirred. He turned back toward the barn, but not without one last glance. Something, or someone, had been here. And for the first time in years, the possibility that Elsie could return sparked quietly in the shadows of his mind. He didn't let himself hope fully. Not yet, but the ember had been lit. That evening, the wind brought a chill. Clouds thickened. The first hints of rain teased the horizon. Bramble stood in his old stall as thunder rumbled in the distance. The stable creaked and shifted, but held strong. He watched the sky from the open door. He remembered storms here, the way Elsie used to run barefoot from the house to the barn, arms flailing, laughing as rain drenched her. She'd sing to the thunder, brush him by lantern light. read books aloud while the rain tapped on the roof like hooves on cobblestone. He looked up at the rafters. High above, in the beams, he spotted it. A bundle of faded blankets tucked into the hayloft, a lantern beside it, an old sleeping bag. Elsie used to camp up there when she was mad at her parents. It had been her fortress, her hideaway, her kingdom, and Bramble was her knight. He climbed the ramp to the loft slowly. His legs, strong from wandering, handled the incline easily. The hayloft smelled of dust and time, but it held secrets untouched by decay. He nudged the sleeping bag, still zipped, slightly damp but intact. Beside it, the lantern. He pressed his nose against the bundle of blankets and froze. There, beneath them, was a book, hardcover, frayed edges on the spine, the wind, and the saddle. He remembered that book. She read it to him twice, maybe 3 times. Inside the cover, in messy black ink, "To Bramble, the bravest horse I know. If I don't make it back, know that I loved you. Always." Elsie, his breath caught. He stared at the words. He didn't understand them like a human might, but he understood finality, understood goodbye. Was this her farewell, or her promise to return? The rain began to fall, soft at first, then steady. It tapped on the roof like fingers on a drum. Bramble stayed in the loft, curled near the sleeping bag. Sleep came slow, but eventually it came. And when it did, he dreamed. Of trails under moonlight, of laughter carried on the wind, of a girl on his back, hands in his mane, eyes full of trust. The next morning, the rain had passed. Mist hung low in the fields. The grass shimmered. Birds chirped cautiously. Bramble stood at the barn door watching the path that wound toward the woods. His tail swished once. His ears twitched. And then he heard it, a sound. Soft, deliberate. Footsteps. Human. He turned sharply. From the trees emerged a figure in a faded coat and rain boots. A girl. No, a woman now. Hair tied back, eyes wide, mouth trembling. She stepped closer, dropped her bag, tears already streaming. Bramble? His ears shot forward. She stepped closer. He took 1 step toward her, then another. Bramble. "You waited." She held out her hand, and he leaned in, pressed his forehead gently against her palm. The years collapsed between them like brittle walls, and in that moment, no words were needed. He was home. So was she. Rain still hung on the breeze like a memory reluctant to leave. The sun peeked through heavy clouds, painting streaks of gold across the damp countryside. Dew clung to leaves. Birds, sensing something sacred, chirped in softer tones. Inside the old stable, silence reigned, but it was a different silence now. Not hollow, not haunted, it was the quiet of breath held, of moments realigned, of 2 souls reuniting after wandering in separate directions for far too long. Elsie sat on the wooden floor just inside Bramble's stall, her knees pulled up to her chest. Her fingers trembled as she reached forward, slowly, cautiously, and brushed her palm over Bramble's cheek. His eyes closed. He leaned into her touch, her hand stilled. "I never thought I'd see you again," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I told myself you were probably long gone, that someone had taken you, or worse." She trailed off, unable to finish the thought. Bramble said nothing, but the weight of his presence spoke for him. He stood over her with gentle stillness, ears flicked slightly forward, one hoof shifting now and again like he, too, was trying to grasp whether this moment was real. Elsie looked around the stall and exhaled sharply. "I can't believe this. Place is still standing." She ran her hand along the stall wall, her fingers catching on the faded letters. Bramble, still painted in worn teal. She smiled, then cried again. Outside, the wind rustled through the trees. It carried scents of wet earth and memories. Bramble stepped back as Elsie rose to her feet. She wiped her cheeks and looked him over from head to hoof. "You look strong," she said. "Stronger than I expected." She reached forward and touched. The white blazed down his face. "Still soft here, though. You always were." He snorted softly, tail flicking as if embarrassed. Elsie chuckled. "I missed that." The next few hours moved slowly, like time had to remember how to tick properly again. Elsie stayed in the barn. She unpacked her small bag and laid out a few. Basic supplies, a water bottle, a folded blanket, a small canister of oats she hadn't dared to hope she'd need. She fed Bramble by hand. He ate carefully, respectfully, never greedy. Afterward, she explored the stable. Each corner held a memory. The tack room, where she and her dad once repaired a broken bridle together. The grooming cross-ties, where she'd brushed Bramble until his coat shone like burnished copper. The hayloft, her childhood hideaway, now a shrine to who she once was. She climbed up and sat in the corner. The sleeping bag was still there. So was her old book. When she opened it and saw the note she had written, "To Bramble, the bravest horse, I know." She pressed it to her chest and wept again. How had she ever thought she could leave him behind? The story of her absence came out slowly, in fragments like broken boards being gently pulled loose. "I didn't want to leave," she told Bramble that evening as they sat together in the paddock. "But my parents, they sold the land, said we couldn't afford to keep it. Everything was rushed. I thought maybe they'd let me take you. But then I heard you'd escaped during the auction. No one could find you." She looked at him. You ran because you knew I wouldn't come back." He watched her carefully. "I tried to find you. I did. But no one knew where you'd gone. You were just gone." She lowered her gaze. "I left town after that. College, work, cities that didn't smell like rain or hay. But I never stopped thinking about you. And when I came back last week, I drove past the woods. And something told me to check the old trail." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "You remembered. Even when I forgot who I was, you remembered." Bramble pressed his nose to her shoulder. That night, they slept in the hayloft together, just like they had when she was a teenager escaping curfews and expectations. The storm had passed. The sky outside was a black velvet canvas studded with stars. Bramble dozed beside her, his breath slow and steady. Elsie lay on her back, staring at the rafters. "What do I do now?" she asked aloud, not expecting an answer. The stable offered. No reply, but the silence no longer felt like emptiness. It felt like possibility. The next morning brought bright skies and fresh wind. Elsie woke early. She stretched her limbs, stiff from sleeping on wood and straw, and stood slowly. Bramble was already awake, nudging the edge of the loft. "You're up before me, huh?" She smiled. Together they descended to the main floor. Outside, dew sparkled on the grass. The paddock fence leaned in some places, collapsed in others. The trail gate hung on one hinge. The water trough was rusted and cracked, but it was still a stable. Still a home. "Maybe," she said to Bramble, "this place doesn't have to stay abandoned." He snorted in agreement. The next few days passed in a blur of work and rediscovery. Elsie stayed. She called her job, took a leave of absence. She camped in the stable, walked the land, cleaned out the tack room, and fixed a few boards with tools she found buried in the old shed. Bramble stayed close. They relearned each other. He had grown stronger, more independent. She had changed, too, slower to laugh, but quicker to listen. There was a calm in her now, one Bramble seemed to recognize, and he showed her what had changed. He led her to the old meadow trail, now overgrown with vines and wildflowers. Together they cleared a path, hoof by boot, step by step. They found the creek crossing where he once leapt cleanly over rushing water. They passed the rock outcropping where she used to sketch. They found the tree. The one they carved together. Still there, still strong. Booze. Bone. Afternoon, Elsie stood in the pasture, watching Bramble graze under the shade of the old oak. She held the faded halter in her hands. She had cleaned it, oiled the leather, polished the nameplate. She approached, slowly. "Kiwi, aye?" she whispered. Bramble lifted his head, paused, then stepped forward. She slipped the halter over his head. It fit perfectly. He nuzzled her pocket. She laughed and pulled out a fresh apple slice. "You always like the soft ones best." That evening, Elsie sat in the stable with the journal again. She flipped to the final page. Blank. She reached into her bag and pulled out a pen, and began to write. "I came back, and he remembered. He kept the memories I couldn't carry. He guarded them, protected this place, and me. I don't know what happens next, but I know it starts here." The stable was no longer abandoned. It was healing, like they were. And though the future stretched out with uncertainty, one truth anchored it all. They were together again, and that meant anything was possible. The sky above the stable had changed. Gone was the gray veil of rain and grief. In its place stretched an endless blue, broken only by clouds as soft and lazy as cotton. The breeze danced playfully through the tall grass, stirring the scent of wildflowers, cracked leather, old wood, and something new. Hope, the stable, was no longer silent. It creaked. It breathed. It whispered again. Each day now began with motion. Dust was swept from the rafters. Boards were straightened and nailed. The paddock fence began to rise again, rebuilt one slat at a time. The old feed room, once a nest of cobwebs, now smelled faintly of soap and fresh grain. And at the center of it all stood Elsie and Bramble. Their rhythm returned slowly, like a favorite song remembered after years of silence. Bramble met her each morning by the water trough, snorting softly until she emerged from the loft, bleary-eyed, but smiling. She'd feed him oats and apples, check his hooves, brush the knots from his mane. He'd nuzzle her elbow, step back when asked, lower his head when she sang. They didn't need reins or spurs, just memory and trust. That trust deepened with every hour. It wasn't the same as before. It was stronger, built not on innocence, but on survival. One morning, Elsie opened the storage shed beside the main barn, ATDNC, place she hadn't entered since the move. The door groaned loudly. Inside was a graveyard of their past. Old barrels, a rusted wheelbarrow, a stack of broken jump rails, a blue tarp stiff with mildew. And beneath it all, nearly crushed under time's weight, lay something she hadn't expected to see again. Her saddle. She froze. It was cracked along the seat. The leather had dried and split in places, and the stirrup leathers hung limp like wilted flower stems. But the nameplate still shimmered faintly on the cantle. E. Callahan. Her hand trembled as she reached for it. She carried it back to the barn like it was a newborn. Bramble whinnied from the paddock, sensing her excitement, or maybe just hungry again. She set the saddle on a clean blanket and ran her hands over the worn surface. Every scratch, every crease told a story. Rides through the orchard, jumping puddles that felt like rivers. Sunset gallops through golden fields. Elsie wiped her eyes and whispered, "I'll fix it. I promise." For the next few days, she threw herself into the work. She cleaned the saddle with soft cloths and oils, gently working the leather back into pliability. She replaced the worn girth, cut new stirrup leathers, polished the stirrups, re-threaded the horn strap. Each day, Bramble watched her with quiet eyes, sometimes nudging the process, sometimes stealing apple cores. When she finished, she laid it across a padded bench in the tack room and stepped back. It didn't gleam like it used to, but it shone with something deeper, like an old knight's armor, worn but worthy. That afternoon, she led Bramble into the pasture with a halter, no reins, no bridle. He followed without question. She slipped the saddle gently onto his back. He stiffened, only for a moment. Then he sighed and relaxed. She tightened the girth slowly, whispering, "You tell me when it's too much, okay?" He flicked, his tail in reply. They didn't ride that day. Instead, she walked beside him down the familiar trail, the saddle in place but her feet on the ground. He walked tall, ears pricked like he knew something sacred was returning. And it was. Later, that week she visited the town for supplies. It had changed. New buildings, new faces. But the feed store still stood, with its green tin roof and creaky screen door. Inside, Elsie browsed slowly. Buckets, brushes, rope, grain. She wasn't sure how much to buy, wasn't even sure if she'd stay long. Enough to use it all, but something in her pushed her to prepare. She placed the items on the counter. The clerk, a man with a grizzled beard and eyes like river stones, studied her. "You Callahan's girl?" he asked. Elsie paused. "I was," nodded. "Heard someone was back at the old stable. Figured it was just wind." "Nope," she smiled. "It's me. And Bramble." The man's eyes softened. "I remember that horse. Smart one. Ran off during the auction, didn't he?" "Yeah," Elsie said quietly. "He ran to wait for me." The clerk smiled. "I'll give you a discount." By the time she returned to the stable, Bramble was waiting at the gate, stomping impatiently. "I wasn't gone that long," she laughed. He nickered loudly, nudging her bag. She poured grain into the trough and ruffled his forelock. Then, her eyes landed on something behind him. Footprints, fresh, human. Her smile faded. She scanned the tree line. Nothing moved. The breeze was light. The grass shifted only with nature's rhythm. Still. She checked the barn. Everything was in place. She double-checked the loft, the book, the journal, her bag, all there. But the feeling lingered. Someone had been close. Someone who wasn't her. That night, she sat in the loft with Bramble just outside below her, drowsing under the stars. She opened the journal again, another blank page. She began to write. "I'm not sure who's watching us, but I'm not afraid. Not anymore. This place has been broken and put back together before. So have we. If someone's out there, I hope they see the same thing I do. A new beginning growing. In old soil." She paused, then added, "P.S. I think we'll ride tomorrow." The next morning was still. Clear. Sacred. She rose early and brushed Bramble until his coat gleamed like amber. She saddled him slowly, carefully, buckled the girth, adjusted the stirrups. Then she led him to the old mounting log beside the paddock. Fence. She climbed up, paused, waited. He turned his head slightly. She whispered, "May I?" He stilled, and then he shifted his weight. Yes. She swung her leg over. For the first time in nearly 8 years, she was on his back. The saddle creaked softly. She held her breath. And then she exhaled. They walked at first. Down the trail, through the orchard, toward the creek. Bramble's hooves fell with familiar rhythm. His back was warm, his stride sure. Elsie leaned forward, rested her hand on his neck. "You remember everything," she said. even when I didn't. They paused at the creek crossing, the one he had jumped as a younger horse. She stared at it, then at him. You don't have to. He snorted once. Then he stepped back and leapt. Over the water, over the doubt, over the past. When they landed, Elsie laughed through her tears. She gripped the saddle horn, buried her face in his mane, and Bramble. He trotted forward like he never missed a step. That night the stable glowed from within. Elsie lit the old lantern. She hung the halter on its peg. She polished the stirrups. She swept the floor. Then she sat in the stall with Bramble curled beside her, and she wrote, "We're not just remembering anymore. We're becoming." The world had changed, but somehow it had come full circle. The sky above the stable no longer watched in silence. It blazed with blue in the daytime and shimmered with stars at night. Grass had crept back across the paddock, wildflowers returned to the fence line, and the trails had reopened under Bramble's hooves and Elsie's quiet guidance. Each day was a heartbeat. Each ride was a breath. And the stable, once hollow and forgotten, now felt like it had been waiting not just for Elsie to come back, but for her to become who she was always meant to be. Elsie had made a decision. She wasn't leaving. The paperwork was filed. The property was hers again, officially, bought back from a man who hadn't touched it since the auction. She used every cent she had saved, gave up her city job, and closed the door on the life she had built without Bramble, because this was the life that mattered, not traffic or deadlines or lattes, but fences and saddle soap and the smell of hay. In the morning, she spent her days rebuilding what was broken. The paddock fence stood strong again, wrapped in new wood and care. She patched the roof, repaired the water trough, cleared out the thistle-choked garden behind the barn and planted it with carrots, apples, and herbs. Each evening, Bramble would watch from the shade of the oak as she worked, sometimes snoozing, sometimes following her like a shadow. And each night, when the fireflies danced between the grass blades and the sky turned violet, they'd sit together at the edge of the field, watching the world exhale. One afternoon, as she mucked out the stalls, she heard it again. Footsteps. This time, not distant, not hiding. She turned, pitchfork in hand. A figure stood at the edge of the paddock just beyond the gate. A man in his late 40s, gray-streaked hair, work boots caked with mud. He took off his hat. "Didn't mean to scare you," he said. Elsie narrowed her eyes. "Can I help you?" He nodded toward Bramble, who stood nearby, alert but calm. That him? She hesitated. "Who wants to know? I was here the day he got loose," the man said, voice slow and worn. "Back during the auction. I tried to stop him. He ran before they could sell him. Smartest horse I ever saw." Elsie slowly lowered the pitchfork. "I never forgot that day," he added. The way he looked back, like he knew exactly where he was going, like he was headed somewhere important. He paused, then looked at her. "I think he was running toward you." Elsie swallowed. "He found this place again," she said. "I just followed." The man nodded slowly. "Name's Miller," he said. "I own the next property over. If you need lumber, I've got extra." She nodded once. "Thank you." Miller looked around. "It's good to see this place alive." Again. The visits from neighbors came slowly after that. A retired schoolteacher brought a basket of eggs and wild honey. A young girl asked if she could meet the story horse. A pair of teens offered to help fix the barn roof in exchange for riding lessons someday. Elsie didn't expect it, she didn't ask, but somehow, as she rebuilt the stable, the community began to rebuild around her. Because places with roots don't just grow grass. They grow people. One late summer morning, Elsie stood beside Bramble at the edge of the orchard trail. He wore the saddle again, his head high, his coat sleek. "I think," she said, adjusting the girth, "we should show them." Bramble shifted his weight. She mounted gently, adjusted her seat, and took a deep breath. Let's go. They moved through the trees with ease. The sun filtered through the leaves like old stories retold. Birds chirped. Wind hummed. The ground beneath them remembered every step. They reached the old open meadow, the one she had avoided since her return, the place where he had last carried her before the world cracked apart. She paused. He didn't. Bramble trotted forward into the sun, mane flying, hooves pounding like thunder softened by time. Elsie closed her eyes, leaned forward, and let the rhythm carry her, faster, higher, free. When they stopped, she was laughing and crying and whole. That evening, as stars pushed through the velvet dusk, she lit the lantern in the barn. Bramble stood nearby, eyes closed, swaying gently. She reached for the journal, now nearly full, and wrote the final entry. He waited for me. Through storms, through silence. Through years I thought I'd lost forever. He held on to what I couldn't, and when I came back, he didn't ask where I'd been. He just walked with me until I remembered how to run. This is our home. Again. Forever. She closed the book and slid it into the trunk where it had first been found. Then she stepped outside, stood beside Bramble, and looked up at the stars. He leaned into her, shoulder to shoulder, and for the first time in years, she said it aloud. We made it home. The end.